Welcome to the Rethink Vertical podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by the UAS Cluster Initiative. Today I sit down with Dr. Michelle Harper, lead principal research scientist with the MITRE Corporation. Over the last 15 plus years, Michelle has led national data-driven strategic initiatives through the integrated use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, human-machine teaming methods, and the application of advanced analytics to generate actionable intelligence. Michelle has led the development of a range of data sharing programs and applied research studies supported by the FAA, DoD, and NASA. She is currently leading the development of strategic plan for the FAA's safety community of interest, advising on an FAA roadmap for AI assurance, and directing an FAA initiative focused on the development of an enterprise-wide aircraft lifecycle data model. Michelle resides in Bentonville, Arkansas, where she has recently become increasingly engaged with the regional UAS and advanced air mobility critical infrastructure developments. Michelle has spent most of her career thinking about aviation safety data, and so it's really great to get some insight in how large amounts of data that will come from autonomous aviation systems will impact the industry. I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, Michelle, thank you for joining us on Rethink Vertical. Happy to have you on the podcast.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So Michelle, I know MITRE. Let's talk a little bit about MITRE, about the organization. I know I spent so many years in the FAA, working very closely with folks from MITRE, but I think, and I'm always surprised how many folks don't know anything about MITRE. So you want to share with the audience a little bit about what MITRE is, what it does, what it doesn't do, and maybe fill in some of those gaps.
Yep, absolutely. So MITRE is a not-for-profit, and we work kind of right in between government and industry, and specifically we run a series of federally funded research and development centers for various branches of the government. The one that I'm most involved with is the FFRDC for the FAA. And basically what that means is that the federal government made a decision many years ago that they needed to be able to point to a neutral third-party set of subject matter experts and do so in a non-competitive environment. And so there are a number of federal labs across the country. MITRE is one, Lincoln Labs is another, NASA is another, that the government can go to when they have a complex or challenging problem without having to compete it, and to do so in a way that our responsibility as we're running the FAA's, FFRDC, or any of our other government agencies is to be neutral. To bring a zero conflict of interest perspective, to ensure that as we're addressing, scoping, identifying, defining challenging problems that we're doing so from a neutral, equitable standpoint for all stakeholders. Yeah. So we don't compete. We're a nonprofit. We're probably one of the largest companies that a lot of people haven't heard about because we don't market. We're horrible at marketing, and we actually aren't supposed to. And when I say we don't compete, if a company or a government or state, local, regional group comes to us and says, "Hey, we need help with X," and there is a for-profit company that already does that work, we're obligated to say, "Well, that's actually not something we can help you with." But if a state, local, regional, nonprofit, or even a for-profit company says, "Hey, we've got this complex problem, and we see it as a whole of nation problem, or a problem that could impact security, safety, or well-being of the country," then it's a potential work that MITRE could in fact support.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I think when I talk to folks, anytime they see agencies like yours, although there's not really any other organizations like MITRE that I'm familiar with, they get a little bit of anxiety about is this group going to come in and take away contracting opportunities? So I think it's really great that you mentioned that you're not allowed to compete, and actually you just have to get out of the way if there's companies already kind of working in that space. So with that said, Michelle, I know the folks in your team have been very involved with both the UAS and AAM industry recently. Maybe talk a little bit about why the FAA reached out and what are some of the things that you guys find interesting and really kind of in your wheelhouse that will help move this industry forward that you're working on?
Yeah. So a number of years ago, the as we started to see what the FAA calls new entrants, right? So these are originally UAS operations, and now have started to evolve into more advanced air mobility operations. The interesting thing about these operations is they're not happening at a federal level. Right? They're happening at the local, state, regional, tribal level. Right? These are local, what we consider local governments who are investing large amounts, in some cases, of infrastructure funding to stand up drum ports, corridors, infrastructure for these advanced air mobility types of capabilities. And they were doing so without a whole lot of guidance from the FAA. Right. And we see more and more of these pilot programs and actually more structured approvals that the FAA is moving forward with. And MITRE's been involved in advising the FAA on how to, on areas that may be of more interest for them to regulate. Right. So the FAA actually has not only endorsed the work that we're doing at the state, local, federal levels, but they've actually we brief them on a regular basis on what we're doing because despite the fact that this is a branch of the government, they just don't have that far-reaching capabilities, and the growth that we're seeing in this industry is exponential.
Yeah,
and I think a couple of years ago we were maybe 3 or 4 states, and I think we're up to maybe 16 of these projects now.
Oh wow!
Yeah, but it's drastically growing,
Right.
And I feel like there's constantly another project that pops up. So if that project is somewhat of a standard type of UASA project that doesn't really have that there is a streamlined path for how that work can be done safely, accurately, then it's not necessarily a project that MITRE would be involved with because there's means to support that type of work. But as we're looking at things that are a little more advanced, whether it's these large corridors or maybe more advanced technology, then these are some of the areas that MITRE's been more involved with.
Yeah, so things that are more on the leading edge, a little bit more, maybe fewer pilots, but just trying to understand how to impact the nation as a whole. Yeah.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about data. This is right in your wheelhouse, right? So, as I mentioned in the intro earlier, data science, human factors, these are all kind of areas that you've lived in for a while. When we think about these fully autonomous systems, right? We have autonomous systems now in traditional aircraft. We talk about fully autonomous, aircraft that don't have pilots on board for the most part. That's where we're going. All this data that's both being collected and then being used, modeled. How is the FAA planning to handle this large amount of data, either internally or externally, or how is it going to look at it? I know that's a very broad question, but.
So it's a big question, right? And we kind of have to break it down into pieces. So the FAA has actually been fairly successful starting about 15 or so years ago in working with fixed wing commercial operators and setting up and funding a program, and then stepping back and letting labor, industry, MITRE groups run this program. It's called ASIAS. It's Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing Program. And it is one of the kind of poster childs for non-punitive proprietary data sharing in the world. We've got about 150 commercial operators, fixed wing and rotorcraft operators who provide digital recorded flight data, FDR data, as well as safety reporting data. We merge all that data together with radar data, environmental data, and other types of information that's available, including air traffic related data, created a set of different types of data models. And then the kind of carrot for the industry to participate in these programs is that we then the SIAS program turns out what's called a benchmark. Right? So they share the proprietary data with us. we worked with the industry and labor groups to basically write the rules for the data sharing. And the FAA does not get direct access to it because the FAA is a government agent is FOIable. Right? So it's a third party, which is MITRE at the moment, houses, maintains, and manages the program, right? Which keeps us from being keeps the data from being susceptible to FOIA. And again, the carrot there is that for the industry is that they get a benchmark, and what that basically is, it's a metric that shows how they're doing compared to their peers on a whole range of different safety issues, from unstable approach to altitude deviations. There's, I think we're up to maybe 60 some odd metrics now. It's a really nice example of what can happen if you have a group of open-minded industry representatives with labor at the table, right, protecting the proprietary nature of the data, proprietary nature of pilots and controllers. FAA footed the bill, and it's continuing to foot the bill, but we've been able to demonstrate and share the value from a safety perspective of a non-punitive data sharing project or program.
Yeah.
So fast forward to the emergence of new entrants into the NAS. We don't have a program like that right now for all of our UAS and growing AAM operators. There's been a lot of discussion around that. I think that we are approaching, if not at a point with some of the types of UAS operations, the package delivery operations, where we're seeing, where we know there is a large amount of data that's being collected. In a perfect world, those operators would come together like the fixed wing commercial operators, the 121 operators, and say, hey, we're operating in a similar type of environment. We're operating in a similar type of mission. Let's start sharing and pull from the lessons learned that we have from the SIS program. I think we'll get there. We're not quite there yet because it's still a very heavily competitive environment, right, for those new entrants. But there is an altruistic component of this, as well as I think, business component, because the minute we start to see more serious incidents and accidents occur in that new entrant space, it impacts everyone. Right. And so the safety metrics, the recommendations for safety initiatives that come out of these programs that the FAA endorses kind of sets the bar for how safety can be upheld within these various types of operations.
Yeah, that's some really interesting insight, which I hadn't thought about. If you think about how long it took the aircraft to convince traditional aircraft carriers to have this culture of sharing and for the good of the ecosystem, even though they're all super competitive. And even now, if it's a new thing that the FAA wants airlines to share, they're very, okay, let's make sure that we're not going to give away any competitive advantages before we do this. And so now we're asking a whole new industry to do the same thing in an accelerated way, right? So the airlines had decades to get there. Now we're asking folks who have never played in this system, who are trying to we want their businesses to survive and don't want to give away too much, but we also need them to be collaborative. And I remember having some discussions with current and former FAAers that said, we keep telling, the major players in the industry, you've got to talk to each other. You've got to share data. And they're all like, yeah, that sounds good on paper, but the reality is we don't want to give away any secrets because we're all competing to survive. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. So good luck with that, Michelle.
Well, we actually, I think to the UAS and AAM industry credit, we were exploring the concepts of information sharing with the FAA right now, as the FAA is trying to determine how are they going to certify advanced analytics and specifically use of AI
Right.
in the design assurance all the way through operations, right? There's a lot of interest. I think to the industry's credit, there's a lot of collaboration. You see groups like AUVSI are a perfect example, right? It's grown tremendously, right? And so you do see, I think there is quite a bit of interest. Now, you get down to the brass tacks and there's an agreement to be signed to actually share information, and then legal gets involved. Then, then it becomes really interesting. And one of the factors that really helped with the ASIAS program is that labor is at the table. Now, that's not going to be the case with the emerging entrants. So that's kind of an interesting. So pilot labor groups as well as controller labor groups were at the table saying, okay, these are our requirements for ensuring the protection of the pilots and controllers. So the legal hurdles can be pretty challenging, but if there is and one of the things that we saw is that a core set of industry Part 121 operators came forward first, right, and said, we want to do this. We are informally doing this, right? Where safety departments, are calling, we talk to each other. Can we more formally do this so we can get a better perspective on the NAS in general? So I'm optimistic that we're going to get there, just from the sheer participation that you see, the participation in groups like, just the sheer number of industry, UAS industry meetings that we have.
Right.
But can we, and we have a model for how to do this with the feds, right, with the FAA.
Which will help for sure, right? There's a path to follow, and it's just I think it's making everyone comfortable. Everyone's comfortable out loud saying we want to be collaborative, but it's giving them comfortable with the process of what that actually means and what you need to provide and what the value is. Yeah.
You have folks like Billy Nolan who have been absolutely ingrained in non-punitive safety programs from day one. Right? I worked with him when he was at American for many years, and now working with Archer. It's these types of people that are, we call them our catalysts. Right? Yeah. They're kind of the ace in the hole, and that as they're working with these companies, they have that long-term historic knowledge of how these programs can work. Not to put a whole bunch of pressure on Billy, but
pressure.
But you see a lot of, you see this right across the industry where folks go and are now working for these companies, and that to me that's encouraging.
Yeah, and they currently nominated FAA administrator, right? So same sort of thing. We'll see how that goes. You touched on it and you kind of opened Pandora's box. Let's talk a little bit about AI. Let's talk about machine learning. It's all the rage now. And, but when you break it down as far as these emerging entrants in aviation in general, what are the real value adds for AI? And like, what's really interesting to you right now that's going on that you guys are thinking about? I know you mentioned like, how do we certify these systems in an aerospace environment, but is there anything else that is interesting folks should know about?
So with regards to AI, I think the bottom line is we really don't know the extent to which it's going to touch almost every aspect of operations, from design of aircraft all the way through the monitoring of that aircraft as it exists in the NAS. The possibilities are endless. Right? Where we're seeing the industry move is in some areas that are that they believe are going to be easier to certify. Right, so there's a couple companies that have kind of drawn a black box around an AI capability. They've got lots and lots of data to enable a specific type of application to be enhanced using AI. They're drawing a black box around that capability and then coming to the FAA and saying, okay, this black box will solve this problem, right? What do we need to do to get certification? And now the FAA isn't going to be able to say X, Y, and Z, right? Check these boxes, but we are looking at, we're working with the FAA right now and looking at a number of different safety assurance processes for AI-enabled systems. Because eventually the FAA will need to put out standards, recommendations, and potentially even regulations on how these types of systems will be assured from a safety perspective. So the FAA there's a fairly somewhat new chief senior technical advisor in the FAA. His name's Chung Pham. He is specifically focused on AI and AI assurance, which means by AI assurance, what we mean is what are the processes that need to be in place to ensure that AI enhanced system is operating at a level of validation and verification that we would expect. And a big challenge there is with AI, you have potentially hundreds of millions of records that are pieces of data that are feeding the AI algorithm,
right?
That enable and that algorithm has then learned from that data, right? And then you put that algorithm, you freeze it, and you put it into whatever part of your aviation system that you're trying to automate. How do you ensure that that data, your hundreds of millions of records, represents your domain that you're going to operate in?
Right.
That your data appropriately represents all of the potential variables that aircraft will encounter, and that specific AI enhanced system would need to account for in an operational domain. So that is one of the challenges that we're helping the FAA with right now. And I think that at this point I do think that the FAA has a good perspective on it. So they're saying, okay, let's work this bottom up. Let's look at what the industry is building out now. And they've got some great connections with industry represented. Rather than top down, rather than saying, okay, these are the rules you're going to follow by, let's look at what's being introduced potentially introduced into the NAS and build assurance processes around that.
As you're talking about all the new rulemaking efforts, it makes me think there's the Office of Rulemaking is going to need to expand. I mean, they're going to have a lot on their plate when you start talking about just rules and procedures and processes that just don't yet exist. And so I think resources and staffing have always been a challenge with the FAA. So I'm not sure if folks are thinking about that and talking to appropriators about future budgets. Yeah,
I think that one of the models at the FAA, and they've talked about it somewhat, is bringing in experts to help in the certification process, right? Because the science, really, when we talk about AI, we're talking about a new science, right? It's really interesting, and I find it fascinating. My background is human factors, so to listen to the conversations, some of the kind of larger conversations that I've been involved with, and just people using terminology in different ways. Like, we don't even have standard terminology yet. There's a group, SAE, a subgroup to the SAE that is working on an AI taxonomy right now. So we're kind of eagerly awaiting that, and it's being spearheaded by EASA. So we're hoping that that's going to help with when we do sit down and have these conversations with industry and others, that we have a common language to start from. And it isn't the most exciting thing to talk about a standard taxonomy, but it really helps, right? Because then we can actually we can all be on the same page when we're talking about these complex systems.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you make about bringing in that expertise from the outside, because the reality is it's a very new science, and the expertise, we just don't have it internally at the agency. So,
Right.
and I think it's something that the FAA has been doing more and more, bringing that expertise, and it's good to hear that they've got an advisor on board that is focused on that. We won't post his email address for the folks,
And they've been the FAA, to the credit, has been expanding what they call their SISTA group, and putting and the SISTAs being these experts with deep-seated knowledge of these various areas that we're seeing the FAA needs to have expertise in. Right? There's a new one for a new SISTA recently for focus kind of on digital twins, on digitization, digital twins, digital engineering. So I think that's a positive thing, right? The extent to which, from a technology standpoint, from a subject matter standpoint, that can actually get transcribed into a set of enhanced procedures or processes for ensuring safety certification, might end up being a bit of a lengthier road than some people would like. But I think this bottom-up approach may have some. I really like the practical component of it, right? That we're not coming down. The FAA isn't coming down and saying these are the rules that we'll abide by, but actually working with the industry to see, okay, what are you doing? What's working? What do you need? Right? What types of assurance processes are you internally using? And we're seeing actually quite a bit of willingness to share that in that non-punitive way with the FAA.
Yeah, a lot of work to do, but I think it's encouraging to hear that the FAA is not waiting around. Like, it sees seen the challenges for a while, but it's really taken action to try to take care of some of those. As we wrap up, I know we could spend hours just talking about this, but are there any specific maybe projects that you would like to see, you think would be valuable for the industry to really kind of move things forward and help the industry scale? Or is there some that MITRE's involved in that maybe you could talk about, maybe not, that folks should know about that are going on?
Probably two things. So one, I was involved in a project last year that I thought was super fascinating. We developed a conceptual model for the aircraft life cycle, and it's not a data model. It's not a physical or logical model. It's actually a conceptual model that we started with, looking at the business functions that the FAA supports across the life cycle, the certification and safety assurance of an aircraft. And we did this in a way that's generic enough to where we could apply it to other types, any type of aircraft. We kind of started with the Part 25 aircraft, but what we did there is we actually drilled down into orders, FAA orders. Again, not super exciting, but looking across the business functions that the FAA supports. What are they required to do? What are those decisions and determinations they're required to make as that aircraft goes through the life cycle? What do they do in practice? Right, so that was really interesting. And here's the order, but here's what they interviewing folks, and here's what we do in practice. And we pulled in a whole bunch of subject matter experts across various lines of business, and came up with this aircraft life cycle model from a decision-making standpoint. And we did so with the intent that we really want to try and capture not just the decisions and determinations that have to be made, but what information do they need to make those decisions? What information do they have? What information would they like to have? And what data do they use? Right. So we wanted to. Our goal was to tie it to that data so that we could use this information to support data enhanced decision making processes. And now we're seeing this work. We put it into a visualization. With descriptive visualization software, so you can kind of play around with it. And we're seeing it's being used across a number of new projects for this year.
That's fascinating. That's something I would have liked to seen.
It's kind of fun to play around with.
Right.
I mean, I think that, we can always do things in Excel or, whatnot. And we worked with a modeler and actually put it into an interactive model. So we're seeing that kind of level setting of, if someone doesn't truly understand, well, what is it that aircraft certification does in the initial intake of an applicant? What are the decisions and determinations that have to be made? There really wasn't a single place to go to unless you wanted to read through piles of orders, which no one wants to do.
Right.
And then tying that to the actual information needs and the data. So we think that this is going to be useful for some of the digital engineering work that we're doing right now. Some of the updates to various data systems, training, and other projects. So that was kind of a fun project to work on.
Yeah, and just finding ways for the FAA to see internal efficiencies, right? That can work through, right? Because it goes back to that resource thing. It's like there's not going to be a windfall of new employees probably anytime soon, and so they need to figure out how to process this information and make sure everybody's following. I used to always say that different lines of business, you talk about AI black boxes, it's the same thing. It's like it goes into an office, and depending on, who's in the office, it can vary the process that it goes through, and even maybe not even in line with the order. So it's just a good review for them to see, like, are we following the order? Do we have a process? Can we repeat this over and over again multiple times?
Right. And we're hoping to be able to use some of this work to address some of those inefficiencies. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of technical debt. And Congress has kind of consistently called for the FAA to move away from non-digitized data sources, right? Kind of pulling from various other government agencies that have gone electronic, right?
Yeah.
And so there's some pressure there, and you could do that by diving headfirst into looking at the data. But we're saying, hey, if you take a step back and look at, well, what are the decisions and determinations that have to be made? Then we can start to align. Okay, well, this is why this data source may be a higher priority to focus digitization on than another data source, right? Or this data source is going to actually, if we improve on it, could in fact address a gap that we have between aircraft certification and flight standards.
Yeah.
Right? And these are the decision-making processes between those two organizations that could be enhanced if we focused on improving the sharing of or enhancements of those data, these specific data sources.
Yeah. Really great to try not to boil the ocean, right? Learn a lot and try to pick out the pieces that are most valuable to tackle on the front end.
Yeah, and then we have some amazing off-the-shelf capabilities that have just exponentially grown, right? Large language models and other types of AI capabilities. We have data ingest tools now that are incredibly intelligent, that can take massive amounts of data and generate a model and then throw a human in the loop. So, the industry is using these tools. The FAA is starting to use some of these tools. And so I'm looking at a more modern approach to enterprise data management is really what one of the things that I'm hopeful that the FAA is going to start moving towards.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure we're, not running this out too long, but the human in the loop thing is really interesting. And so we're probably going to need a podcast number 2 to cover that, because a couple of questions absolutely. I have just on human in the loop and like responsibility and collecting safety data on that. And then like, how far can that go? And so and how AI is going to impact that. I think it's something we're seeing a lot of. So we'll have to take a rain check on that conversation.
That might be part 2.
Part 2 for
near
sure.
Near dear to my heart, but lots of I think lots of job security there, because we got a lot to,
for sure.
to do with that area.
Yeah. Definitely looking forward to that conversation. Well, Michelle, I really appreciate you taking out time, your busy schedule to sit down and talk. And I know the folks listening will find it super valuable and interesting. Thanks for coming on. If you'd like to be a part of the UAS Cluster Initiative community and get access to more of our content, check us out at www.uascluster.com. www.uascluster.com.